The Arizona Territory in 1887 was no place for the weak-hearted, and Thomas McKenna had learned that lesson well during his 5 years working this unforgiving land. His ranch sat like a lone island in an ocean of red dust and sagebrush, 20 miles south of Tucson, where the desert stretched endlessly toward Mexico. The morning sun painted the distant mountains purple and gold, but Thomas barely noticed the beauty anymore. He'd grown accustomed to the harsh realities of frontier life, where survival meant keeping your rifle close and your trust closer. Thomas stood on his porch, coffee steaming in the tin cup between his weathered hands, watching the horizon for any sign of trouble. At 32, he had the lean build of a man who worked from dawn to dusk, his face bronzed by the relentless sun and marked by lines that spoke of countless squinting days. His dark hair, longer than fashion dictated back east, curled slightly at his collar, and his green eyes held the wariness of someone who had seen too much violence in too short a time. The ranch itself was modest, but well maintained. Thomas had built most of it with his own hands after mustering out of the army following his service in the Apache Wars. The main house was constructed of adobe and timber with thick walls that kept the interior cool during the scorching summer days and warm during the surprisingly cold desert nights. A barn stood 50 yards to the east, housing his 6 horses and the milk cow that provided fresh dairy. Beyond that, a chicken coop and a small vegetable garden completed his little kingdom. He had chosen this location carefully, positioning the buildings near a reliable spring that bubbled up from deep underground, creating a small oasis of green in the otherwise brown landscape. Cottonwood trees provided shade around the house, their leaves rustling in the morning breeze like whispered secrets. The nearest neighbor was Jake Patterson, whose spread lay 8 miles to the north, and even that felt too close on days when Thomas craved complete solitude. This morning felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The air held a tension that made his skin prickle, and the usual desert sounds seemed muted. Even his dog, a mixed breed named Rex, with more courage than sense, paced restlessly near the front steps instead of sprawling in his favorite patch of shade. Thomas had just turned to go back inside when Rex began growling low in his throat, his hackles rising as he stared toward the eastern trail. Thomas followed the dog's gaze and felt his stomach tighten. A figure was approaching on foot, moving slowly through the mesquite and palo verde, still too distant to make out clearly, but unmistakably human. In this part of Arizona Territory, unexpected visitors usually meant one of 3 things: trouble, more trouble, or death. Thomas set down his coffee and stepped inside to retrieve his Winchester rifle, checking to ensure it was loaded before returning to the porch. He didn't point the weapon at the approaching figure, but he kept it ready across his forearm, a clear message that he was prepared for whatever might come. As the figure drew closer, Thomas could see it was a woman, and his surprise deepened. Women didn't travel alone in Apache country, not if they valued their lives. She moved with a peculiar gait, favoring her right leg, and her clothes appeared to be a mixture of traditional Apache dress and cast-off pieces of white settlers' clothing. A faded blue calico skirt hung to her ankles, torn in several places, and over it she wore what looked like a man's cotton shirt, too large for her frame. Around her shoulders she had wrapped a colorful blanket in the Apache style, though it too showed signs of hard wear. Her long black hair hung loose around her face, partially obscuring her features, but Thomas could see she was young, probably no more than 25. Her skin had the warm, bronze tone of the Apache people, and she carried herself with a dignity that seemed at odds with her obviously desperate circumstances. In her hands, she clutched a small bundle wrapped in what appeared to be deerskin. When she reached the wooden gate that marked the entrance to Thomas's property, she stopped and looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of pride and desperate need. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas found himself studying her face, noting the high cheekbones and strong jaw that marked her as one of the Apache, but also seeing something else in her expression, a wariness that matched his own. "You're on private property," Thomas called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. He kept his tone neutral, neither threatening nor welcoming. The woman straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. When she spoke, her English was clear but heavily accented, each word carefully pronounced as if she had learned the language through great effort. "I know this. I come to ask for work. I can clean, cook, tend animals. I ask for food, small place to sleep, nothing more." Thomas studied her more carefully. Apache women were known for their skill in domestic tasks, but hiring an Apache, especially now, would bring nothing but trouble from his neighbors. The recent conflicts between the settlers and the Apache bands had left deep wounds on both sides, and anyone seen helping the Apache was viewed with suspicion at best, outright hostility at worst. "Where's your tribe?" he asked, genuinely curious. The Apache women he had encountered during his army service never traveled alone, always remaining within the protection of their extended families or bands. Something flickered across her face, a shadow of pain so deep that Thomas felt an unexpected stab of sympathy. She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer, but finally she spoke. "They are dead, all dead. Soldiers came to our camp 3 moons ago. They said we were harboring raiders, that we had stolen cattle from the white settlements. This was not true, but the soldiers did not listen to truth. They came at dawn when the men were away hunting. They killed the old ones, the women, the children. I was gathering medicinal plants in the hills. When I returned, there was nothing left but smoke and silence." Thomas felt his chest tighten at her words. He had seen the aftermath of such raids during his military service, and the memory of those smoking ruins still haunted his dreams. The Army's policy of swift retaliation often caught innocent Apache bands in its sweep, creating more enemies than it eliminated. "What's your name?" he asked, though he wasn't sure why it mattered. "I am called Ayana. It means eternal blossom in my language, though I feel more like a dying flower now." The irony in her voice was unmistakable, and Thomas found himself oddly moved by her attempt at humor, despite her obvious desperation. He looked at her more closely, noting the way her clothes hung on her thin frame, the hollowness in her cheeks that spoke of too many days with too little food. "Ayana," he repeated, testing the unfamiliar sounds. "Why come here? Why not go to the reservation?" Her laugh was bitter and short. "The reservation is a place where Apache go to die slowly instead of quickly. I have heard the stories. Disease, starvation, despair. At least out here, if death comes, it will be on my own terms." Thomas understood that sentiment better than he cared to admit. He had seen the reservations during his army days, overcrowded compounds, where proud warrior peoples were expected to become farmers on land that could barely support grass, let alone crops. "I can't hire you," he said finally. "You know what would happen if word got out that I was harboring an Apache. Every rancher between here and Tucson would come calling, and they wouldn't be bringing welcome gifts." Ayana nodded slowly, as if she had expected this answer. "I understand. But perhaps you could spare a small amount of food? I have not eaten in 3 days. I can pay." She held up the deerskin bundle. "I have things to trade." Despite himself, Thomas was curious. What kind of things? She unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing several items that caught the morning light. There was a silver bracelet worked with intricate designs, a small knife with a bone handle carved into the shape of a running horse, and what appeared to be a leather pouch decorated with beadwork. "The bracelet belonged to my grandmother," Ayana explained. "The knife was my husband. The pouch contains medicines, herbs that can heal wounds, stop infection, ease pain." Thomas found himself looking more closely at the knife. The craftsmanship was exceptional, the kind of work that took months to complete. "Your husband, is he dead? Killed by your people 2 years ago during a raid on a supply wagon. He was trying to get food for our band. The children were starving." She paused, her dark eyes meeting his. He was a good man, but desperate people do desperate things. The weight of her words settled between them like a stone. Thomas had participated in the pursuit of Apache raiders during his army service, and he wondered if he might have been among the soldiers who killed her husband. The thought made him uncomfortable in a way he hadn't expected. "Keep your things," he said abruptly. "Wait here." He turned and walked back into the house, leaving Ayanna standing at the gate. In his kitchen, he gathered some supplies: a loaf of bread his neighbor's wife had brought him the week before, some dried beef, a small bag of coffee beans, and a few pieces of fruit from his meager supply. He wrapped everything in a clean cloth and carried it back outside. Ayanna was still standing exactly where he had left her, as motionless as a statue. When she saw what he carried, her eyes widened slightly, but she made no move to reach for it. "This should last you a few days," Thomas said, holding out the bundle. "There's a creek about 2 miles south of here where you can get fresh water. Beyond that, I can't help you." She took the food with both hands, cradling it like something precious. "Thank you. This kindness will not be forgotten." Thomas nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond to her formal gratitude. He watched as she carefully rewrapped her possessions and tucked the food into her larger bundle. When she looked up at him again, he was struck by the intelligence in her dark eyes. "You were a soldier," she said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" "The way you stand, the way you watch, the rifle ready but not aimed. You have the look of a man who has seen war." She paused. "Did you fight my people?" Thomas considered lying, but something in her steady gaze made deception seem pointless. "Yes, 3rd Cavalry, stationed at Fort Bowie. I was part of several campaigns against Apache bands." "Did you kill Apache?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Thomas found himself remembering faces from battles years past, the clash of violence that had seemed so clear-cut when he was wearing a blue uniform. "Yes," he said simply. Ayanna nodded slowly, as if his honesty confirmed something she had already suspected. "War makes killers of many men who would otherwise be peaceful. I do not hate you for doing what you thought was your duty." Her words surprised him. He had expected anger, accusations, perhaps curses in her native tongue. Instead, she offered something that felt almost like absolution. "Why?" he asked. "Your husband, your family, your entire band. Why don't you hate me?" "Hate is a fire that burns the one who carries it more than the one it is aimed at. I have carried enough fire. Now I seek only to survive, perhaps to find some small peace before I join my ancestors." Thomas found himself moved by her words in a way he hadn't expected. There was a wisdom in them that went beyond her years, born of suffering that would have broken lesser people. "The nearest town is Tucson," he said, 20 miles north. "You might find work there, or at least people willing to trade for your crafts. White people in town, they will not welcome Apache woman. They see only the blood that has been spilled, not the person who stands before them." She shouldered her bundle and turned to go. "But perhaps you are right. Perhaps it is worth trying." As she began to walk away, Thomas felt an unexpected pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe just the loneliness that had been his constant companion since leaving the army. "Ayanna," he called out. She stopped and turned back to him. "There's a cave about a mile west of here up in the Red Rocks. It's got fresh water and shelter from the weather. If you need a place to rest safely for a night or two, it's better than sleeping in the open." Something that might have been surprise crossed her features. "You would tell me this? Help me this much?" "It's just information. What you do with it is your business." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read something written there in a language she didn't quite understand. Finally, she nodded. "Your kindness honors you, Thomas McKenna." He started at the sound of his name. "How do you know who I am?" "Apache know the names of all who live in our traditional hunting grounds. We know which ones are quick to violence and which ones might be reasoned with. Your name is known as one who fights when he must, but does not seek unnecessary bloodshed." With that, she turned and walked away, her slight figure gradually disappearing into the heat haze that was already beginning to rise from the desert floor. Thomas stood on his porch for a long time after she was gone, Rex settling back into his favorite sleeping spot as the tension in the air gradually dissipated. The rest of the day passed slowly. Thomas went through his usual routines, tending to his animals, checking the fences, working on repairs to the barn roof that had been damaged in the last windstorm. But his mind kept returning to the conversation with Ayanna, to the dignity she had maintained despite her desperate circumstances, to the way she had spoken of her dead husband and family without bitterness or self-pity. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of red and gold, Thomas found himself looking toward the red rocks where he had told Ayanna about the cave. He wondered if she had taken his advice, if she was up there now looking down at his ranch, or if she had continued on toward Tucson, despite her doubts about the reception she would receive there. 3 days passed without any sign of her. Thomas told himself he was relieved. The last thing he needed was the complication of an Apache woman hanging around his property, especially one whose very presence would be seen as a provocation by his neighbors. But he couldn't shake the memory of her face, the way she had carried herself with such dignity despite her obvious desperation. On the 4th morning, he woke to find Rex barking frantically outside. Thomas grabbed his rifle and hurried to the front door, expecting to see raiders or rustlers or some other form of trouble. Instead, he found Ayanna collapsed near his front gate, her bundle scattered on the ground beside her. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. Even from a distance, Thomas could see that she was in bad shape. Her face was flushed with fever, and there was a dark stain on her shirt that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Thomas looked around quickly, scanning the horizon for any sign that she had been followed or that her presence here might have been observed. Seeing nothing, he made a decision that he knew might change everything. He set down his rifle, walked to where she lay, and gently gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he had expected, her body burning with fever. Up close, he could see that she had been wounded, probably several days ago from the look of it. There was a bullet graze along her left ribs that had become infected, the kind of injury that would heal cleanly with proper care, but could easily turn fatal if left untreated. Thomas carried her into his house and laid her on his own bed, the only one in the small dwelling. Her fever was high enough to be dangerous, and the infection in her wound was clearly spreading. If he was going to save her life, he would need to act quickly. He heated water on his stove and gathered what medical supplies he had: clean cloth for bandages, whiskey for disinfecting, needle and thread for stitching if needed. As he worked to clean her wound, Ayanna stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Easy," Thomas said softly. "You're safe. You're hurt, but you're going to be all right." She tried to sit up, but he gently pressed her back down. "The cave," she whispered. "Someone came. Men with guns. They were looking for Apache. I had to run." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Probably a posse from Tucson or one of the other settlements, out hunting for Apache to blame for some real or imagined offense. Such groups had become more common in recent months, made up of men who saw every Apache as a potential threat to be eliminated. "They shot you. One of them saw me leaving the cave. I was not fast enough." She closed her eyes, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. "I am sorry to bring trouble to your home." "You're not bringing trouble. You're hurt and you need help." Thomas surprised himself with the firmness in his voice. "Rest now. We'll worry about everything else later." As he cleaned and dressed her wound, Thomas found himself thinking about the choice he was making. By bringing Ayanna into his house, by caring for her, he was crossing a line that would be impossible to uncross. If word got out that he was harboring an Apache woman, especially one who had been shot by a white posse, the consequences could be severe. But as he looked down at her fever-flushed face, at the way she had trusted him enough to come to his ranch when she had nowhere else to go, Thomas realized that he didn't care about the consequences. Something about this woman had touched a part of him that he thought had died during the war, a capacity for compassion that he had buried under years of violence and cynicism. Over the next 2 days, Thomas tended to Ayanna with the kind of careful attention he might have given to a wounded animal. He changed her bandages, made sure she drank plenty of water, and prepared broths from the dried vegetables in his small garden. Gradually, her fever broke, and the infection in her wound began to recede. On the third day, she was strong enough to sit up in bed, though she was still weak from blood loss and the fever. Thomas brought her a bowl of rabbit stew, one of the few dishes he could prepare with any skill. "You saved my life," she said simply as she accepted the bowl. "This debt cannot be repaid with silver or beadwork." "You don't owe me anything," Thomas replied. "Any decent person would have done the same." "Would they?" Ayana's dark eyes met his. "In my experience, decent people are rarer than you might think, especially when the wounded person has skin like mine." Thomas couldn't argue with that observation. He had seen too much of the hatred and fear that existed between whites and Apache to pretend otherwise. "What will you do when you're well enough to travel?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, stirring the stew thoughtfully. "I do not know. The cave is no longer safe. Tucson will not welcome me. Perhaps I will go south toward Mexico. Some Apache bands have found refuge there. That's a long journey for someone traveling alone." "Yes, but what choice do I have?" Thomas found himself thinking about that question over the next few days as Ayana grew stronger. She was an excellent patient, never complaining despite what must have been considerable pain, always grateful for whatever small comforts he could provide. She helped with what tasks she could manage from bed, mending a torn shirt, helping him organize his meager medical supplies, even offering advice about which of his plants might be useful for treating various ailments. "Your knowledge of medicine is impressive," Thomas commented one evening, as she explained the properties of a desert plant he had never paid much attention to. "Apache women learn such things from childhood. We must be able to care for our families when there are no medicine men available, especially during times of war." She paused, a shadow crossing her face. "Though, in the end, all my knowledge could not save those I loved most. You can't blame yourself for what happened to your band." "Can I not? Perhaps if I had been there, I could have warned them, helped them escape. Perhaps if I had convinced my husband not to join the raid that killed him, he would still be alive. And perhaps you would be dead with them," Thomas said gently. "Sometimes survival itself is a kind of victory." Ayana looked at him with those intelligent, dark eyes, and Thomas had the unsettling feeling that she could see straight through to his soul. "You speak as one who knows something about survival," she said. "What battles have you survived that others did not?" Thomas found himself telling her about the war, about friends who had died while he lived, about the guilt that had driven him to leave the army and seek solace in the isolation of his ranch. He talked about nightmares that still woke him some nights, about the way violence had a way of marking a man's soul even when his body emerged unmarked. "War leaves scars that never fully heal," Ayana said when he finished. "But those scars can also make us more understanding of others' pain. Is that what happened to you? Is that why you don't hate me for being a soldier?" "Partly, but also because I have learned that hate destroys the hater more than the hated. My grandmother taught me this. She lived through many conflicts between Apache and white soldiers, saw much death on both sides. She said that the only way to survive with your spirit intact was to remember that most people, whether Apache or white, are simply trying to protect what they love." Thomas pondered her words as the days passed. Ayana was proving to be unlike anyone he had ever met, Apache or white. Her intelligence was evident in every conversation, but it was her wisdom that truly impressed him. Despite having every reason to be bitter and hateful, she seemed to have found a kind of peace that he envied. By the end of the first week, she was strong enough to get out of bed for short periods. Thomas found her one morning standing on his porch, looking out at the desert landscape with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, joining her. "Yes, but also dangerous, like many beautiful things." She glanced at him sideways. "Your neighbors, they will wonder why you have not been seen in town lately." Thomas realized she was right. He usually made a trip to Tucson at least once a week for supplies and news. His absence would be noted, and eventually someone would come to check on him. "What do you suggest?" he asked. "I should leave. Tonight, perhaps, when the moon is dark. I'm strong enough now to travel." The thought of her leaving filled Thomas with an unexpected sense of loss. Over the past week, he had grown accustomed to her presence, to their evening conversations, to the way she seemed to understand things about him that he had never put into words. "Where will you go?" "South, as I planned. There are Apache bands in the Sierra Madre Mountains who might accept a widow seeking refuge. That's hundreds of miles through some of the most dangerous country in North America." "Yes, but staying here will bring danger to both of us." Thomas knew she was right, but he found himself reluctant to let her go. What if there was another option? Ayana turned to look at him directly. "What do you mean? What if you stayed? Not permanently, just until you're fully healed and strong enough for such a journey. That could take weeks. Your neighbors will surely come calling before then." "Maybe, or maybe I could think of a way to explain your presence that wouldn't cause trouble." Ayana studied his face carefully. "You would risk your reputation, your safety, your home, for an Apache woman you barely know?" Thomas met her gaze steadily. "I've been thinking about that. The answer is yes, I would, but only if you want to stay." Something shifted in her expression, a softening that made her look younger and more vulnerable than he had yet seen her. "Why?" she asked softly. Thomas considered the question seriously. Why was he willing to take such risks for her? Was it simply compassion for someone in need, or was there something more? "Because in the past week, you've reminded me what it feels like to not be alone," he said finally. "Because your wisdom and strength humble me. Because I think you understand parts of me that I've never been able to explain to anyone else." They stood together in silence for a moment, the morning breeze rustling the cottonwood leaves above them. "Continue,"